The earliest titles by Infocom were the first three Zork games, which originally they sold those in blister packs. From there, they moved on to the more extravagant, it's called a folio type of package, which is it's large and kind of extravagant. When Origin took their Ultima series away from Sierra in 1983, they also began putting little props and trinkets in their packaging, but Infocom was pretty much the only one doing it on such a grand scale at the time. Feelies, I despise that word.
What word do you prefer?
I call them props or trinkets or something. It's just a personal thing I have. Feelies sounds like you're touching someone inappropriately. So when you're dealing with a game that's all text, no graphics, the player pretty much has to envision everything. And the trinkets were kind of designed to help facilitate that. You know, it's a piece of the story, it's a piece of the game world that you can actually hold in your hands and look at. And it kind of gets your imagination rolling and puts you more in the mood of being an active participant in that game. I think Adventure International focused more on publishing as many titles as possible, especially back in the early 80s. They would take submissions from anybody who cared to submit a program. In addition to the original 12 Scott Adams adventure games, they published tons of clones of arcade games. They published early strategy games. Adventure International really focused more on quantity over quality, I think. And they would even one thing about Adventure International, they would actually include inside their packaging a little flyer stating "Send us your programs and maybe we'll publish them." They would actually request that players, people who bought their games, who played their games, send in programs that they wrote on their own, and they would consider it for publication. A lot of adventure games at the time were, you know, two-word parser, very limited descriptions, simple or sometimes completely illogical puzzles. Infocom took it a step further by actually creating more of an interactive novel rather than just you know, a set of puzzles where you basically type the magic word to solve them. They had it really was more like playing a book than playing a game, and I was a pretty avid reader at the time, so you know, when I finally got my own computer in, I believe it would have been in 7th grade. Yeah, it just seemed like a natural choice for me. And then as I enjoyed their games, my interest in the company itself also grew. So that by the time when I got to college, I was trying to accumulate a complete collection of the Infocom gray box packaging. And like I said, this was when I discovered the internet also in college. I discovered how you could buy and trade things with people over the internet, and from there I discovered the folio package variations, which I had missed the first time around because I had not come across Infocom games until I was in the 7th grade. So I completely missed the folio era. But when I found those, I decided I wanted to get all of those as well. One thing led to another. I began picking up other text adventures that I had seen or heard about and had wanted to play, and 12 years later, I have an entire room of my house dedicated to this. I would say it's a toss-up between either the star-crossed saucer or the suspended face mask. Just because it was completely unlike anything else that had been done at the time, and really there isn't anything else that has been done since. the problem they ran into with that is retailers hated those huge odd-shaped packages because, they're hard to display on a store shelf. It was really kind of the renaissance for as far as game packaging design, because Infocom just did whatever they wanted. It was very experimental, and they put out some really gorgeous looking packages that really we have not seen anything like since then. And keep in mind, these were not collector's editions. These were the standard versions of the packaging. Nowadays, when you see something like that, it's a collector's edition. It sells for $10 or $20 more, and they produce them in limited quantities, and everybody tends to keep them because they're being sold as collector's items. Whereas with most people threw out their star-crossed saucers because it's an odd-shaped package. It's hard to store on a shelf. And because of that, it's going to be collectible someday. Nowadays they're selling for 10, 15 times the retail price. Whereas the modern collector's editions probably will not be worth much, I don't think, because people tend to keep them, because they're being specifically sold as collector editions. Does that make sense? Nowadays, everybody has the collector mentality. eBay has really done that to our culture, I think. Back then, I'm sure nobody was thinking that 15, 20, 25 years from now, that any of these Infocom packages with all their little props and trinkets would be worth anything to anybody. I'm sure they weren't even considering that back then. As far as finding new trading partners, it's great. As far as trying to obtain rare items, it's becoming more and more difficult. Even some common items I've seen on eBay, the prices are just spiraling completely out of control. You see astronomical prices. You see items that were once thought of as common going for $100 or even $200. It's insane. It's becoming an expensive hobby to get into. I have no idea why some of these people would spend so much money. I just can't imagine it. I have a graphic adventure of Planetfall, which was only released for a Japanese computer. There were a number of Infocom releases in Japan, graphical versions of the text adventures with music in the background that were never shown. They were never released overseas here in this country. From a collecting standpoint, I thought it was interesting as a curiosity. I would like to actually play the graphical Zork 1 on my Sega Saturn. I do have the ability to play imports. I just don't have the ability to read in Japanese. But I would like to play it someday. I think it kind of gets away from Infocom's original intentions with the series, but it's an interesting curiosity. I would probably say that Guardians of Infinity by Paragon Software is an interesting, obscure text adventure. Basically, what you're doing is you control a group of time-traveling agents who are trying to prevent the assassination of President Kennedy. And what you do is you give each of them commands through a windowed environment. You type commands to each agent, and they report back to you when they've completed whatever objectives you give them. It came with a really painstakingly researched couple volumes of information about, where everybody in the Kennedy assassination was, in the days and weeks leading up to it. It was just a really well-researched, very well put together, and very unique adventure game that it really never got the attention I thought it deserved. That would be my vote. I would say the primary factor in the death of commercial IF was the trend toward graphics, as hardware improved. I know that's what everybody says on the subject, but there is definitely some truth to that. I think another thing is Infocom continued to market them as games, and when people hear the term games, they tend to think of video games, activities played by teenagers, instead of marketing them as interactive literature, which might have been a better approach. It would have sounded a little more mature, would have maybe drawn in some people that would not have normally gotten into this kind of thing. But when you're competing with games, competing with graphics and sound, which were becoming very important in the late 1980s, commercial IF just sort of fell by the wayside.
Do you think that it was something they could have prevented?
Possibly. Infocom possibly, if they hadn't invested so many of their resources into the Cornerstone database product. They might have been able to keep going for a few more years after that. I have a multi-page list of items that I would love to own someday. I will basically be collecting until the day I die. As far as anything in particular, I would love to get a copy of the Jim Pearson screenplay adventure Lucifer's Realm, which was basically banned in this country. Well, at least I've heard it was banned in this country. I have never been able to specifically confirm that. I actually have the European release of it. I would love to get the American release.
So it's just a matter of it's a rumor that it was banned, when in fact
it's rumored. I've talked to people who knew Jim Pearson. He passed away several years ago, but I've talked to people who knew Jim Pearson, and he learned that it was banned. I'm not sure from where, but I'm told he was absolutely delighted by that knowledge. In case you don't know, Lucifer's Realm is a game where you start out by dying, and you go to hell, and you meet various people such as Stalin, Hitler, you meet Satan himself, and you interact with them. So it was, at the time, it was pretty controversial. Yeah, in the 90s, Infocom had been reduced pretty much to a label, a brand name. They did re-release the original 30 or so canonical text adventure games multiple times. There was the Lost Treasures packaging. They divided them into groups of 5 or so and sold like the Adventure Collection, the Fantasy Collection, Sci-Fi Collection, and then they did the Masterpieces Collection, which actually had some modern IF included with it. But yeah, aside from that, for the graphical titles, Infocom and Zork were pretty much brand names, and the later graphical Zorks really did not have a whole lot to do with what Mark Blank and Dave Liebling and Steve Moretsky and those guys originally created back on the mainframe at MIT. I actually picked up Lost Treasures when I got my first PC before I went to college. I actually picked up a copy of Lost Treasures so that I could play all the games from Infocom that I'd missed the first time around. This was about the same time as when I was still trying to accumulate a complete set of gray boxes. But yeah, I did pick them up. I've played through all of them at one point or another. couple of them I've gone back to multiple times. There's a couple that I'd still like to go back to again someday. It's fun to go looking for items that you know existed, but it's even more fun to come across something that you never knew existed. Partly based out of greed, I will admit that. It's also a desire to keep with me a part of the company that I loved so much growing up. It's partly a mild to moderate obsessive-compulsive disorder. You don't have to be obsessive-compulsive with this hobby, but it helps. And just because the Infocom packaging was so physical, it's a piece of the game world you can hold in your hands. It's just neat to keep that sort of thing around. When you play their different games, you can get a sense of their different personalities, different senses of humor, based on the type of puzzles they design, the humorous or dramatic scenarios that they programmed into their games. You really get a feel for the individual authors. They each had a unique style and a unique voice, I would say. Actually, there are all kinds of online databases tracking, who released what. I have a list myself. I keep a list up on my site of everything that I have and everything that I don't have that I know was released. And actually, I even probably have a few things that may not have been released that I've kept track of. If you notice, I've got lots of magazines here, old game magazines, computer magazines from the day. And I would go through those as a kid and make lists of games I wanted to play someday. That's the obsessive-compulsive disorder showing itself again. So, I had lists, before I even started collecting, I had lists of what was available, what the different companies had released, and sometimes even a little of what they were about. So when I started collecting, I would sort of go back to those lists and see what I wanted to play that I didn't have yet, and then I would go out on Usenet and post a request for it or search for it and find somebody who had a copy and buy it off of them. If I find an item in shrink wrap, I will leave it that way. I don't open shrink packages simply because it decreases the value. That's not just my opinion. It's a proven fact that on eBay, shrink-wrapped items will go for a substantially higher margin, maybe 20 to 30% or even higher than an open package. People are just willing to pay more for it. It's not just me. Shrink-wrapped items sell for more, so you have to consider them more valuable. Some people like to play theirs and will open their shrink wraps, and that's fine. They belong to them, so they can do whatever they want with them. I personally do not. There was actually a lot of pressure on me a few years back. I had a rare title in shrink wrap that nobody else had, and there was a lot of pressure for me to open it and let someone copy the disc and preserve the code, which I held my ground on that, and it's a good thing I did because, one, there have been numerous copies that have surfaced since then, and two, the company that published the game was notorious for using cheap disc media, so 20, 25 years down the road, that disc probably would not have been readable anyway, so I would have opened my shrink wrap with nothing to show for it. There's a tendency, especially on eBay, to exaggerate rarity, to exaggerate condition. Everything tends to be mint followed by 20 exclamation points. A lot of people, I think, tend to jump in without really doing their homework, without learning a little more about what's available and what's rare versus what's common. All the time you see people bidding on stuff that's basically junk, and it's like you wonder why they're bidding on some of it. They just don't do their homework before. I keep my items down here in a cool, dry place with a moderate temperature. I bag them with acid-free comic book bags to keep the dust off of them, and also to minimize the shelf wear. You know, when I'm sliding them around, if I have a new item I need to put on the shelves, I'll need to move stuff around sometimes. Bagging them does cut down on the shelf wear. I've heard of people, storing them in damp places or places that get really hot in the summer, like attics, which is never a good idea. The disc media will eventually deteriorate over time and become unreadable, which is why there are a lot of people archiving this stuff. Have you talked to Sarah Nee at Home of the Underdogs by chance?
Not yet.
Not yet? Do you plan to?
If I can.
If you can, okay. Yeah, there are a lot of people interested in preserving the actual game code. Enough of those that I feel that job is pretty much taken care of. I don't need to worry about that myself personally. As far as the shelf life for the boxes, I haven't seen any of them reach the point where they're falling apart yet. When you look back at vintage items from the 1940s or 50s, vintage toys from that era, I guess you can kind of use the conditions you typically find those boxes in as kind of a benchmark to go from as far as the packaging for computer software from the 80s. You figure in about in another 50, 60 years it'll probably look along those lines. Maybe a little better if I've done my job here preserving it well. I think the historians, the people with an interest in the history of computer gaming, will probably understand the important role that text adventures played in computer history. I think they might look at it as kind of a lost art form. Does that make sense? I get emails from people asking why I'm asking so much money for these, because they're old games. Old technology tends to be viewed as not particularly valuable to people who aren't really in the know. I do get people asking all the time where I can find such and such title, and more often than not, I point them to either another collector's site or to eBay, because everything turns up there eventually. I tend to deal mainly with collectors, so my prices tend to be a little higher than what the average casual user who just wants to pick up that old game that he played as a kid and play it again. I tend to charge a little more than what those people are willing to pay.
Right.
I think the pure adventure game is kind of a dying art. Nowadays we're kind of moving into action adventure games, which still have puzzles for the players to solve, but it's also balanced out by combat along with the exploration. Sometimes there's some 3D platforming involved. The pure adventure game is kind of becoming a lost art. The approach of multiple solutions to problems has always been interesting, not only because it lends replay value, but because it shows that the designers really tried to think of everything that the player might think of. A lot of times when I'm playing a modern graphical adventure, I will come up with solutions to puzzles that the designers either didn't even consider or didn't even bother to implement. And it's frustrating because you kind of see what could have been if they had taken the time, put the little extra effort into that. On the other hand, it's harder to do that with a graphic adventure because you have to program all of that. You have to create graphics for all these alternate puzzle solutions. Whereas with interactive fiction, it's just a matter of looking for another command the player enters and typing in an appropriate response for that. So it's sort of a trade-off. I'm not sure there's any good way to really make that work with the modern adventures without a lot of extra work on the designer's part on things that the average casual player would probably never even see. You always have your memories of the games you enjoyed as a kid. It's fun. It's fun to have them, to take them down and look at them and show people. This is how games used to be. This is how the game industry used to be. Back when, I would say back before it really became completely commercial. Nowadays, the bottom line is profit. Profit is the primary factor in a company deciding to release a game. Whereas back in the days of Infocom, you get the impression that those guys would have written games even if nobody was playing them, just because they seem to enjoy it so much. Just because it was so neat for them to be able to create these worlds for other people to play in. And just because you have all these neat little props and trinkets and things to get you into the story.